only 20% of longevity is genetic. So the good news is
Ah,
that a lot of it's in our hands because it's epigenetic.
clinically proven strategies that are super easy to implement, almost things that can happen on automatic to help them improve their sleep quality.
We know full well how to arm ourselves against viruses. There are now 17 separate studies showing the higher your vitamin D level, the safer you are from COVID.
What I'm trying to do with my life is to shake the world up, to realize that we don't have to accept what we think is the inevitable. And so the mantra in my lab and in the book that I wrote is nothing is inevitable. And the problem with aging is that we accept it because it's so common. We see everything around us get old and we say, well, maybe we just have to accept it. And it was my grandmother who taught me that that didn't have to be the case. She raised me because my mother was working and she was young. She had my father when she was only 15. And so that, going back to the 1930s, that was a big deal, right? She was kicked out of high school. But she came to Australia, ran away from Europe, from Hungary, and raised me. And her view was adults screw up everything because she'd seen what happened during the war and afterwards. But she was a huge rebel. She was the ultimate rebel. Our 16-year-old daughter has the same genes, so it's tough raising her. But the attitude when I was young was rules are meant to be broken. So she taught me, and the police probably will remember a few of these things. She taught me you don't have to wear what people say you have to wear. So she was kicked off Bondi Beach for wearing a bikini, which in those days was illegal. She used to drive like a maniac, not speeding so much, but she would drive like this, looking around and dance to the music. So the car is going like this to Beethoven's Ninth and that kind of thing. So I've grown up saying we don't have to accept the way the world is. Adults screw up everything. But she also was a humanist. She wasn't religious, but she said, David, you have to do the best you can to leave your mark and allow humanity to reach its potential and not let others screw it up. So I've spent every day doing that. But why aging? Because to me, it's obvious. This is the biggest unsolved problem. If aliens came down to see us and judged us as a species, they'd say, pretty good on atomic theory, quantum mechanics. But this aging thing, you don't even realize it's a problem that you can solve. We figured that out 50,000 years ago. What are you doing? And that's what I'm trying to do here with the time that I have.
Yeah, and you said in the book, and it was very jarring to see, you said that there is no biological reason for us to age. And in fact, you said that aging is, and you approach it as being a disease.
Well, it is a disease. It's just, we can call it whatever we want. But what is a disease? A disease is something that happens over time that causes you to have a disability, which you know well, and it causes frailty and eventually it can cause death, okay? That's aging, right? Is it not? So what's the difference? Why do we separate disease from aging? The only difference is because aging happens to more than 50% of us. And that's a crazy distinction. I would say that that's even more important, that we focus research, development, policy on actually what kills most of us.
This is really fascinating because for me, just you bringing up the conversation in the way that you did, I realized that we know pieces of aging, like what it looks like, and we're attempting to address different pieces, but there is no unified theory of aging, as you pointed out. But there are these characteristics of aging that we're all trying to attack.
Well, that was true a few years ago. What I've put forth in my book is a theory that I think can explain why we age and explain why all these other things happen. Now, we scientists, we love to put things into categories, and we came up with about 7 or 8 causes of aging. We call these the hallmarks. Don't want to get too carried away, call them hallmarks. And we've been very satisfied for the last probably 8 years that this is the roadmap to extending lifespan. If you can solve or treat each one of these 8, then we'll live longer. Now that I have no qualms with. I think that's true. But that still begs the question, what causes those to happen? And so my theory, I've called it the information theory of aging. And if you boil it down to an equation, if you want, it's first principles, I think aging is a loss of information. And that's what's causing the problem. So what we need to do is A, preserve the information and see if there's a backup hard drive of youthfulness that we can tap into and reset our computers.
This is so fascinating. you specifically, and this is a great segue into looking at the digital nature of DNA. And I like when I read this in your book, it really just flipped a switch for me because there's a digital aspect, and then when we're talking about our genes and our gene expression, there's an analog aspect. So let's talk about this digital aspect of DNA.
Yeah, well, this is the crux of everything. And most scientists don't talk the way I do. We've had to invent our own vocabulary and metaphors. So DNA, we all are very familiar with. Without DNA that we get from our parents, we're screwed, right? Without the ability to encode proteins and run the cell. It's important. But that information is much more robust than we realize. We think of it as this very fragile chemical. It's actually not fragile. You can boil it. You can find it in fossils. It's
Right.
pretty strong.
Millions of years. Oh,
Yeah. So this is
wow.
robust, and it can certainly last 80 years, our lifespan. It can probably last 1,000 years if we're good to it. So what's the other problem? So that you said that's the digital part of the genome or the information. So there's A, T, C, G. Okay, people will remember from high school days if they're not biologists. It's just a digital code encoded in chemicals, 4 of them. And instead of being as ones and zeros, it's just 4 letters. But there's this other type of information that's just as important for our survival, and that's the epigenome. Okay, so what's the epigenome? That's a complex word for the control systems that control the genome in the way that, forgive my anachronism here, but a DVD is the digital information, and the analog is the ability to read that. So the DVD player is analog. So it's moving around, and it can move in any possible direction. What does that mean for the cell? Well, what's actually literally happening is that as we develop as embryos, we're spooling out parts of DNA in every cell, differently in every cell. So if you're a nerve cell at this part of the brain that's developing, you'll have this big loop of DNA, and those genes will stay on for most of your life, if not all. But there are parts that you don't want on. You don't want a liver gene on in the brain. So it spools out very tightly, like you would a hose reel, and that keeps these genes off, hopefully for 100 years or more. But what I'm proposing is that insults to the body, and if our body becomes complacent, and there are good things we can do to our bodies, what we lose is that structure, these loops and these tight bundles, and those fall apart. We can see that in our studies, and we can actually measure that, and it's a clock. It's a clock of aging. If we measure those loops and the changes to this epigenome, I can actually tell you how old you are biologically, and I can predict with high accuracy when you're going to die, almost to the month.
Wow. That's nuts.
Scary, right? I
Yeah.
haven't had it done. Would you get your clock done?
I mean, and this is just a little sidebar here, but this brings to mind the science behind telomeres and measuring that as this biological marker. But there's more. There's much
Right.
more to it. That's just one aspect.
Yeah, and what's comforting about this theory, and it's the mark of any decent theory, is that it should be able to explain not just one aspect, but all aspects of a very complex system. And aging is the ultimate complex system.
Yeah.
And we've also got 1,000 years of observation that we have to explain. And if it doesn't explain half of it, throw the theory out. But as I've described in my book, the theory does actually explain everything, even telomere loss. Telomeres are the ends of chromosomes that wear down over time. The epigenome, the proteins that package those loops and those bundles, are also packaging the ends of the chromosomes. And the unraveling leads to an acceleration of that loss as well.
Right.
And actually the factors that stabilize our epigenome, and we work on some of these, they're called sirtuins. We've worked on them for 20 years. We can activate them by being healthy. They are involved in protecting the ends of chromosomes as well and bundling them tightly so they don't erode and cause aging to happen as well.
Yeah. I want to talk about these sirtuins. This is really, really fascinating. So is this under that umbrella of what you're calling longevity genes?
Yes.
Okay. And how many are there?
Well, in total, there's dozens, but they fall into 3 main categories that we know of. The sirtuins, there are 7 of them in our
And we
bodies.
all have some of them.
Well, you better have all of them or you're dead.
There you
They're
go.
really
Right.
important. But we have better copies than others. Some people have variants that predispose them to long life. There's one called SIRT6, and if you have your genome, we can have a look to see if you've got the right variant to live a long time. But by the way, only 20% of longevity is genetic. So the good news is
Ah,
that a lot of it's in our hands because it's epigenetic. That's what's great about this theory is that if I'm right, genes are only a tiny part of the story. But these genes are still important because they protect the epigenome and make sure that DVD is read correctly
yeah.
and doesn't get scratches so you can read the symphony for longer.
This is so fascinating. And I love that so much. And just to know and to have the affirmation with science that only 10 to 20% of our longevity has to do with our genetics. And this goes back because as I was reading, before I got to this part, I was thinking about the Human Genome Project. Just automatically, my mind always goes there when I hear about genes and all the work that went into it. I think it was like at least $1 billion to try to map the human genome. And we get back like, there's like 20,000 genes, and we're thinking we'll have hundreds of thousands or whatever the number might be. But the big missing piece was this junk DNA, right? There was all this other data that was just ignored because it didn't fit into the category of being a gene.
Well, that's right. And we still don't have a complete human genome because these missing pieces are very repetitive. And there are also little genes that were missed by the computer algorithms in the 2000s, which we, in my lab and others, we've gone back and we've compared humans to chimps and macaque monkeys. And these little genes, there are thousands of those, we think, with proteins swimming in our bloodstream that control health and longevity. We have a lot to learn about the genome, but what people have mostly missed is the epigenome, because that's a lot harder to read. Right? You can read a code, that's a one-dimensional program. But to read something in 3 and even 4 dimensions, if you include our lifespan over time, that required another 20 years of innovation. But we now have the tools where we can, this is really amazing. For something that costs, I think it's a few $1,000s, but it's the size of a candy bar. It's about that big. In my lab, we can do your whole genome. Instead of for $1 billion, I could do it for maybe a couple of $100 now. Take me a couple of days. But we can also now read the epigenome and tell us where those loops are, where those bundles are, and also measure the chemicals that accumulate on our genome that tell us where the loops should be and how old we are, literally how old we are biologically.
Right.
So throw out the candles. Who cares about candles? It's those chemical marks that seem to determine our actual age and how healthy we are.
This is so cool. So I'm thinking in terms like we need to stop celebrating our chronological birthday and celebrate these biological birthdays because they're different.
Well, they are. But the good news is you can't really turn back your chronological age. You can't really, well, you can lie about your age, but it's not going to help.
Fake
but
ID.
you can, what we've discovered is we can now dial up aging, speed it up in animals. And now that we know how aging, we think we know how aging works, we can also reverse it.
Yeah.
So that's what I wanted to tell the world about, because that changes how you think about your life.
Absolutely. I mean, I couldn't help but think about myself. In my experience, when I was 20 years old, I was diagnosed with a condition that's usually attributed to people who are much older, right? I had degenerative spinal disease, degenerative disc disease. And my physician said I had the spine of an 80-year-old man, not a healthy 80-year-old either. And to get that bill of goods when you're just 20, of course, it could do a big number on your psyche. But he also said this was incurable, right? I've created this situation and there's nothing I can do about it. And we can get into the nocebo effect and all that stuff, but the bottom line is it took about 2 years before I decided, let me try to do something about this. And I got a scan done. It's probably been about a year ago now. And my spine looks younger than the age I'm at now, right? How is that even possible? You know, and this is what you're talking about in the book.
Well, that's the power of the epigenome. You're not changing your genome. You get that from your parents. But you can change your lifestyle. You can change it tomorrow. And you did. You were in a back brace as well. You
I had
threw
a
that
back
off.
brace. Yep.
Yeah, it's impressive. But it doesn't
Forrest
surprise
Gumped
me.
it, man. Yeah.
Really. And that's what I want everybody to know. And you're doing a great job telling the world is that you can change your life. You can change your health just by how you live your life, even without medicines.
Yeah.
And it's pretty easy to do, right? But it's super powerful. And the message that I'm bringing is, thanks to work in my lab and dozens around the world, we've also figured out, we think, why these things that you're doing and people who are healthy, why they work. Because they're turning on these defensive genes, these longevity genes that are in our bodies, but they don't get activated unless we do the right things, eat the right time of the day, we get enough sleep, we exercise in the right way. Then these genes come on and they protect us. And they don't just slow aging. We see that they reverse many aspects of aging as well.
Yeah. And I want to talk about some of these things specifically. But before we do, I really want to give people, I think it's a brilliant analogy of our genes functioning sort of like the keys on a piano. So can you share that analogy?
Yeah, sure. So the genes are like a piano with 20,000 keys. And imagine there's a pianist that's perfectly young and skillful when we're young. And this is our cells are able to read the right genes at the right time and place. So that's why when we get a cut, we get a cold, we recover very quickly. But what's happening is the pianist in each of our cells starts to lose her eyesight, starts to become a little bit demented, and initially plays a few of the wrong keys. But if you're listening not too attentively, it still sounds great. But over time, what's happening is then she's losing her eyesight, she can't see the music, and she's banging the wrong keys. Eventually, it sounds like crap, and it's a cacophony, and everyone's walking out of the symphony or the performance. That's what aging is. Our cells are losing their ability to read the right genes at the right time because of these loops and these structures that we think we can now reset. So we can actually, we think, go in, give the pianist, or even get a new pianist, or give that pianist glasses and new music. And within just a matter of weeks, now you get the symphony back again. And cells work like they did when they were young again.
Wow. So cool. And can we talk a little bit about, so how does the epigenetics play into that whole equation?
Oh, so the epigenetics are, it's brand new. So this is science that you will not really read about anywhere else. The epigenetics are laid down during development. So as we're embryos, I mean, one of the miracles of what exists on this planet is you can take a fertilized single cell and make a baby that comes out with 26 billion cells that all know what they are and how to work and work together. But over time, those instructions in each of those cells, not the genes, but the ability to read the right genes, is lost. And that gets accelerated in part by not activating our longevity genes well. When we're young, we have a lot of activity. We don't need to exercise as much, right? But as we get older, they become complacent. If we're obese, if we sit around all day, you've written a book, I've written a book, we know what happens to our bodies. They lose activity, it's brutal. And eventually, the pianist has lost her ability to play it. But what's great about what we've discovered is that you can make sure that those keys, the pianist stays young. She doesn't need glasses for much longer. And then what I didn't know until about a year ago, and it is described in the book because I was writing it as we were making these discoveries, is that there's a backup pianist in our cells, every one of them, that tells those loops and those bundles what they were like when we were babies. And we can access those just by turning on a set of 3 genes out of those 20,000 that sets in motion a program to reset the entire cell.
Wow, this is so cool. So cool. So would the pianist be function sort of like the epigenetics?
Yeah, the pianist is the epigenome and the piano is the genome.
So it's determining which keys are getting played, which genes are getting expressed, and which ones aren't.
That's right. Yeah. And every cell has to do that because the nerve cell in your brain has been there since we were young, and it's got to stay a nerve cell. If it starts behaving like a skin cell, we're in trouble. But that's what I think aging is. If we take an old mouse, 2 years old, and we look at its skin is going to look more like a nerve cell. And we have to remind it, go back to being a skin cell, you fool. But we can now do that. We have these reprogramming factors, reprogramming genes that tells the epigenome how to restructure itself and read the genes as though it was young, and cells remember what they should be doing. But old people we see, or at least in old mice, we see that there are a cacophony, a mess, a melange of different cell types instead of being rigorously, you're a nerve cell, get back to being a nerve cell. And one of the amazing things that we did by resetting the eye, so we use the eye as one of our test tissues. We can take an old mouse that's a year old and it doesn't see very well. We can actually measure mouse eyesight a number of ways. We can either measure the electrical impulses, or we can see if they can see moving objects. And in both those cases, we can, by delivering these epigenetic reprogramming genes, we can tell the nerves at the back of that old eye to function again, to play the right keys, so turn on the right genes to be young. They do it. And just a few weeks later, those mice can see as well as they did when they were babies.
Fascinating. That's so fascinating.
And that's a complex organ. We're not talking about
absolutely, right.
just skin. An eye is probably the most complex part of the body. Well, the brain's probably more complex, but this is a big deal.
Yeah. At track practice, I'm coming around the curve onto the straightaway, and I broke my hip. And there was no trauma involved. Nobody hit me. I didn't fall. It just broke because, cut to a few years later, I finally get diagnosed with this degenerative bone disease. And at the time, being 16 years old, you have the hormones of like a Greek god, so, you get the kind of standard of care, take these NSAIDs, stay off the leg, you'll get better. And I did, but nobody stopped to ask the question, how can a young man break his hip just from running? And once I finally got this diagnosis, it felt good to know what the issue was, but also it kind of sent my world into a tailspin.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy that it broke. It's really crazy that they didn't ask why it happened.
Exactly,
but the thing that I find most interesting in the story is that you decide to ask the question, what are my vertebrae made of?
Yeah.
And taking that ownership, which you must have been like your late teens at that point.
Yeah, so this was 20 years old when I finally get the diagnosis. And I'm in college at the time. And, I went from like a chronic kind of nuisance of a pain to chronic debilitating pain over the course of a few weeks. And this is important and I always like to share this whenever I can. My very first physician, he put my MRI up for me to see, and he told me that I had the spine of an 80-year-old man. I had 2 ruptured discs, and my vertebrae were deteriorating. And so when he says this to me, I'm immediately like, okay, so what do we do? Like, let's fix it, And he's like, I'm sorry, son, there's nothing you can do about this. And what happened, and I know you've heard about this several times, the placebo effect is something where you get a positive injunction from somebody who's an authority figure, and you proceed to have certain symptoms happen or changes in your physiology. And a lot of people don't realize this, but placebos are actually 33% effective. That's the power of the mind. But what he did for me was something called a nocebo effect. This is giving somebody a negative injunction that something bad is going to happen, and your physiology begins to change from that. And so I spent the next 2.5 years in a lot of pain, a lot of drugs, prescribed and over the counter, and just laying on my floor, because not only was this painful, but it was embarrassing. I went from kind of being one of the cool guys to like, I'm walking around campus with a back brace and just, really kind of losing myself. I saw different doctors. I, went through the whole gamut of why me? Why did this happen to me? Why won't somebody help me? And really playing this victim role. And it wasn't until I actually decided to get well that everything changed. And most people never do that with their bodies, with their health, with their relationships. It's mostly like, I'll see what'll happen, wishful thinking, I'll give this a try. But when you really decide something, you're cutting away the possibility of anything else but that thing. And I'm a big student of lexicon, and the word decision is from the Latin de, meaning from, and caedere, which means to cut. So when you make a real decision about something, you cut away the possibility of anything else but that thing. And so I decided, no matter what, I'm going to get well. And that sent me, and it wasn't like, the clouds parted and like the sun shined and everything was okay. I'm a very analytical person as well. And so I put a plan together. I decided, and now it's time to do something. Number one, put a plan together, and that plan entailed 3 specific things. I changed the way I was eating, which giving my body the actual raw materials that it needed to regenerate me was important. And I was on what I called the tough diet at the time, which is a typical university food. So I'm no joke, I'm eating pizza daily. My vitamin C is coming like from Sunny D. And so it's no wonder I was made out of terrible stuff, And so I asked this really important question, which you mentioned, okay, if my spine is deteriorating, if my bones are deteriorating, what is it actually made of? And that set me down this incredible path of discovery, because what we hear in kind of common culture is, if you want strong, healthy bones, drink milk. And come to find out, calcium is one of the least important things. And even getting it from your diet, it doesn't exactly work in your body the way that we're marketed to because it's marketing. And so I found out that things like silica, magnesium, sulfur-bearing amino acids, all these things are in some cases even more important. So I start to get all those nutrients in my body through food, primarily. Once I really got it, like food is gonna.
And was that, so how did you get that? Because that's where it's becoming a lot more popular now, but when you would have been going through this, people didn't really think like that.
Yeah.
I mean, this is around the time I was thinking if I was eating licorice and it was fine because it was fat-free, right? And somebody said, well, I think if you eat too much sugar, it turns into fat. And like that didn't even make sense to me. I was like, how would that be possible?
Yeah, especially I'm from the Midwest. And so like there was like a wild oats market. Whole Foods had just opened. And so I think it's really important, the environment. You know, when I had some friends, they would take me to the stores, and then, you know, that gradually got me into like, not just the supplement aisle. And so I just began to flood my body with all these important nutrients and also hydration. Your disc in between the vertebrae and your spine. And you would think like, if I want these to be more hydrated, I need to drink more water, but it doesn't work like that. Your disc get hydrated through a process called remote diffusion. And so literally it's like the last place in your body that gets nutrients and hydration. And so you needed to really super hydrate yourself. Make sure your body has an abundance, like an overflow of nutrients to make sure they get to the right place. So that was number one, was nutrition. Number two was movement. And so exercise is really about two main things. Number one is assimilation. And I came across some research that showed that when you actually are doing walking while taking on specific supplements for your bone density goes even higher, all right? Because that walking helps your body to assimilate. Number two is elimination, you know, elimination of toxins. Because your lymphatic system, which, especially when you're getting healthier, your body is trading out a lot of stuff. And there's a lot of dead cells, there's a lot of metabolic waste products. And so how do you get that stuff out of your system? You have to move, because your lymphatic system doesn't have a pump like your cardiovascular system does. And you actually have 4 times more lymph than you do blood. And so that movement was so important in healing. And here's the problem, is that oftentimes when you have, you know, an injury or an issue like this, we're told not to do anything. That's often the worst thing you can do, because things will start to atrophy. If you don't use it, you lose it. And so I just started to, and it's, of course, if anybody's dealing with like an acute problem right now, like take a day or two off, but I encourage people to do what you can in an intelligent way. And so for me, I could barely walk properly. And so I started off on a stationary bike, progressed to treadmill. I started jogging a little bit. Eventually I picked up the weights again. And, you know, just to jump really quickly to the end of the story, I had lost 28 pounds in the next 6 weeks.
Wow.
And the pain I've been experiencing for 2.5 years was gone. But the third and most important part, now I know, was the rest and recovery, right? It seems like I was resting a lot by not doing anything, but it really wasn't. You know, it was a lot of suffering, and my greatest struggle was at night going to bed, because the pain was so bad it would wake me up. And so I was on, you know, various medications, and I basically had to drug myself to not wake up. And so it was like a pseudo sleep, and it would take several hours before I really like felt like I was awake. And the things that I was doing during the day, changing my lifestyle, showed up for me on the pillow. Because what I really wanted to promote for people is this understanding that if you're not sleeping well, you're not healing well. And this is where your body releases the vast majority of human growth hormone, of the, you know, these various anabolic hormones, reparative enzymes. So when my sleep got improved, I got better so fast. And so I shifted all my coursework over to biology and kinesiology, and eventually opened a clinical practice. And you know, oftentimes I would get those people who they were told there's nothing you can do. You know, you have type 2 diabetes, blood sugars 400 without metformin. There's nothing you can do about it. And consistently seeing these folks be able to naturally regulate their blood sugar, oftentimes get off their medications, insulin, things like that. Because where there's a will, there's 10,000 ways. But it's also understanding that, first of all, just acknowledging that it is possible.
And that's what I love about your story, man. That, like, hearing you tell that, and I've heard you quote the Einstein quote before, that the most important decision anyone will ever make is whether or not they live in a hostile or a friendly universe, which most people don't recognize that as a choice or a decision.
Yeah.
And then 2, that from that, then people will take action because they believe that they will get an outcome. How did you come to that decision, that you live in a universe that's going to work for you?
Yeah.
When the doctor is the one telling you, multiple doctors, in fact, because you said, look, I was, you know, conscious of going and getting multiple opinions. This wasn't one guy.
Yeah.
They all said the same thing. So how in the face of that do you make that decision one day, I am going to get better?
I think it's really valuable to understand the benefit of rock bottom. You know, like for me, after getting those, the words from the other doctors that, you know, there's nothing, you know, the same diagnosis, I had a choice to make. I'm either gonna buy into this and continue to live as a victim, or I'm gonna do something about it. At least try, you know? But for me, it's beyond try, like it's the decision, right? And so how I got to that place really was, you know, I had nothing to lose at that point, you know? I can continue as things are and continue in this suffering. And I think it was just a matter of like realizing that, and I think this is really important, even though there are other people in our lives that might care for us, they don't walk in our shoes, you know? So when the physician would tell me that, you know, there's nothing that I could do, I knew, like, it hit me, like, they're not laying at home thinking about me. I'm thinking about them and why they can't help me. I have to really take responsibility for myself. And it's just basic logic, you know? If somebody's saying they can't help you, believe them, you know? And so I made the decision, like, if I'm gonna get better, I need to do it, you know? I need to take action. It doesn't mean I'm not gonna have great people to support me along the way, but, you know, as Jim Rohn says, no one can do your push-ups for you, you know? So I really had to take action, and it became, you know, and also I wanna share this, is that if you really want something, you should make a study of it, you know? Especially if you don't necessarily have a blueprint for a successful relationship, make it a study. If you're not doing well with your finances, make it a study.
And what does that look like for you?
I generally go right to the medical journals. You know, I dig through there. And another quote from Einstein is that, you know, if you can't explain it simply, you don't know it well enough. And so I really strive to make sense of these things that can be incredibly complex, but for no reason. It wasn't until I really honored my own voice and my gift in helping these things to really make sense for people. And so I'll dig around in that data, and that's the first thing I'll do. And then I'll look for some anecdotal and evidence as well, you know, people telling stories about it. But here's something else I do. I also, and this is the scary part, I also look at the problems with stuff. I also look at the things that are against what I might be believing. Most people don't want to do that. Like, we believe this particular supplement is going to work and it's the best thing, you know, since sliced bread. And then there's these other things that say, hey, wait a minute, this might not be the case. You have to have the courage to look at this too and come to a truly well-evolved thought construct, you know, and we all have that opportunity, but we tend to just want to believe what we believe and look for things to affirm that, you know, and you got to be careful with studies that do the same thing and who's funding the study as well. So I really get to that level most of the time in my research.
It's really interesting to me how, and look, like you said, look at the benefits of rock bottom, but it's really interesting to me how early you came to a lot of this. And I find how people tell their own story to be fascinating beyond all measure. And the opening of your bio says, the first half of my childhood was spent in an idyllic suburban neighborhood, and the second half of my childhood was in the rough and tumble inner cities around gangs and drugs. And you said the power came from both places, and it really helped me understand perspective. How much of that, if at all, played into your ability to sort of see through the trappings of everyone telling you it can't be solved in a way that you say it's just logic, but I think most people fall prey to that and they live there for 60, 70 years.
Yeah.
So how much of that mindset that you got from that sort of dual beginning do you think played into it?
Man, that really hit an emotional chord, hearing you say that. You know, that initial environment was really, it lays the foundation. Well, before the age of about 7, we're in like a theta brainwave state where a lot of things kind of get deeper into our psyche and our subconscious, our programming. And so it's really important, especially for parents, you know, and people who are just, that can be involved in kids' lives, to really understand how impressionable they are. And so I really got a great formatting disc from my grandmother, who really kind of instilled this greatness. She instilled the value of education. I loved learning. Like, I love the process of learning. And so I really picked up early on that you don't want to just learn stuff. You want to become good at learning. And when I shifted my residency, you know, going from this very protected, safe, loving atmosphere, you know, I'm in an environment where, you know, there's a lot of abuse, you know, physical abuse towards myself and my 2 younger siblings, you know, abuse with my mother and stepfather, and the fight, you know, physical fighting. You know, holidays were not like they are now, like get-togethers and family fun. We know the holiday there's going to be, police are going to show up, you know. that environment also taught me something really, really valuable, which is, even though things aren't going well, even though we're short on money, there's always a way to figure it out. No matter how bad things look, we're gonna be okay. So that really was a powerful seed, and combine that with the sense of greatness, the sense of the value of education, the sense of there's always a way to figure something out, really helped that moment of insight to take place, of that decision, that moment of decision. And this is the first time I've articulated this, but that's really how those two things come together.
Dude, I'm stoked that you shared that. That's it's so powerful, and in taking you as a whole and watching your show and watching you on other people's shows, there's this incredible Zen-like quality to your delivery, to your mission, to what you want to do. Like, everything about it is so even keel, right? Because what I find with people that make that transition is it normally breaks them. And one of the things that I'm most intrigued about in life is, and I have the chills, we were just talking about this before we started rolling camera, where you were saying with schools, right? Do you go to one ultra tailored, or do you go, that's gonna be the hardship where my kids have to adapt? And I don't know what's better, because the number of people that are broken by the inner cities, the percentage has got to be absurd, right?
Yeah.
In 80, 90, it's just crazy.
Yeah.
But the people that make it, the ones that find that center, whether it's to be self-centered or not, they find that sense of self. When you said that, that really hit me. That finding that sense of self, not letting the outside world dictate who they're gonna be. Like, now all of a sudden adversity is not such a big deal, because you've got like that compass inside of you and you know where you're going. That feels to me very appropriate for what you've become known for, which is sleep, which even your own publisher was like, write a diet book and you'll be huge and famous and we'll all be rich. Yeah. And you were like, but that's not the truth that needs to be told.
Yeah.
Did that play in? Like, was that a moment of Shawn knowing who he is and what he's trying to do, and he's just gonna get to that end no matter what?
You know what? Wow. Yes, that definitely was. I don't want to cut corners. I wanted, it's integrity is a big word for me. And I wanted to take righteous action. This is all bigger than us. The impact that you're making, the legacy that you're leaving, is so powerful. And we're part of like a big change that's happening with our culture overall, And I knew that this particular topic is, and me being a nutritionist, like, I was all like, food matters, food first, food is the most important thing. But in my practice and seeing people coming in that, we've got these folks over here, 80% of the time are able to reverse type 2 diabetes, heart disease, get off their lisinoprils and all this different stuff. And then we've got this category of people who just like literally sometimes would ironically kind of keep me up at night. Like, what is wrong? Like, I'm doing all these things right. Are they lying to me? And it wasn't until I started to ask people about their sleep that it just like, it changed everything. And this was about 6 years ago. And so then, and here's the key, I can't just tell people they need to sleep more. You know this, like, people don't want to change that much. Like, we want change, but we want to be a little bit, right? And so I found clinically proven strategies that are super easy to implement, almost things that can happen on automatic to help them improve their sleep quality, right? And once we did that, it's like the floodgates would open for people. They've been struggling for sometimes, 15, 20 years with their weight. Finally, the weight comes off, and seeing people struggling with heart disease or high cholesterol, the so-called bad cholesterol, and seeing those numbers finally get regulated once we got their sleep optimized. And I knew that this was an incredibly important part of the conversation that was left out. And as we'll talk about, I know now that our sleep quality is more important than our diet and exercise combined, and what it does for our health, and also literally our physical appearance. Fascinating stuff, how much more fat you lose when you get optimal sleep. It's insane.
That's a bold statement. So walk me through, what are some of the just core benefits that I'm gonna get, assuming that I'm sleeping suboptimally? Like, why is that a problem? Since that's probably one of the most celebrated, like, things like when you get a little sleep, people like champion you. Normally I'd sleep 5 to 6 hours a night with no alarm. Okay, I haven't set an alarm in 15 years. So that was my cycle. I go to bed early, very consistently. My diet is on point. My exercise is on point. And so I'd wake up feeling awesome.
Yeah.
And so I thought, this is cash money. But because I don't set an alarm, that my sleep cycle will change. And right now I'm getting like 7 to 9 hours out of nowhere and super consistently. And I literally have no idea why. I'm warmer now. So I used to be freezing cold at all times. And then at the same time that and I don't know, correlated, causative, no idea, I've started being warmer while I sleep and then during the day. So what are like the core components of sleep? Was something bad happening to me or less than optimal when I was only getting 6 hours, even though I felt good?
Yeah.
Any correlation between the heat and the extra sleep?
There's a lot to unpack there. Number one, what's so interesting is that you were doing something exceptionally right as far as what the research shows with improving your sleep, which is you were going to bed kind of consistently a little bit earlier than other folks might. And so what we call this is this anabolic window, or what we call money time sleep. And this is generally between the hours of 10 and 2 because it's more lined up with your natural melatonin secretion. So if you go to sleep during those times, you actually spend more time in the deepest, most anabolic stages of sleep, and you tend to produce more human growth hormone than other folks. So you were already winning with that. This is why you have a tendency to feel better even if you're getting less sleep, because this isn't called sleep more. Right? It's sleep smarter. And there are many people who sleep, 8 to 9 hours and they wake up feeling like straight up, hot garbage. You know what I'm saying? And they're just wondering why. It's because it's the quality of sleep. And when I say quality of sleep, what does that mean? Let's break that down. So your sleep is regulated by changes in your brain waves. It's really fascinating stuff. And we still don't know really what sleep is. Trying to define sleep is like trying to define when Forrest Gump is like, life is like a box of chocolates, sleep is like pretending to be dead. We don't really know, right? But we do know the changes that happen in the brain. We cycle from kind of a normal waking state with gamma, beta. We're probably in beta right now. We move to alpha, theta, delta is where the deep anabolic dreamless sleep takes place. And we need all of them. And there's a certain percentage we spend in each that helps to rejuvenate our mind and bodies. And if you optimize certain things, you'll do it more efficiently. One of those gear shifts, like if you think about your body like this kind of manual transmission, is melatonin. Like people hear about melatonin as a sleep hormone. It just helps your body to efficiently go through your sleep cycles. And if your melatonin is suppressed by various things, I'll share a couple, then you're not going through those efficiently. And you can wake up feeling like a piñata after the party the next day, even though you're spending all this time on the mattress. So that's number one. Number two, there's this interesting process called thermoregulation. There's a natural drop in your core body temperature at night to help facilitate sleep for all of us, if things are running properly. But what was fascinating, and I shared a study about this, is that they tested insomniacs, and everyone in this particular clinical study all had too high body temperature at night. It would not go down. And so what they did was they fit them with these thermosuits, right, that lowers their skin temperature, not even their core temperature, just 1 degree, and virtually eliminated all their symptoms of insomnia.
Whoa.
Ambien can't do that, all right? And it's as simple as paying attention to how your body temperature influences your sleep. And so with your body temperature changing like that, it's kind of feeling more of an insulation. As a result of having more sleep, there's a ton of different things that could be correlated there. So I'm not gonna say that the sleep is a causative factor, but it's really interesting how your body does change in accordance to sleep. There's a natural rise in your core body temperature as the day goes, as the night goes on, that helps to kind of wake you up. So what I did want to share though, when I said that kind of bold statement in the beginning, when we're talking about how sleep influences your body composition, I think everybody needs to know this. This study really blew my mind, and this was done at the University of Chicago. And they took people and they put them on a calorie-restricted diet, kind of typical stuff, again, I'm taught in college, to see the impact on weight loss when they're sleep deprived or getting enough sleep, all right? So they put the people on this particular diet, monitor everything. One phase of the study, they're getting 8.5 hours of sleep, all right? And then they track all their metrics. Another phase of the study, same exact diet, same exercise, they don't change anything else, but now they sleep deprive them. and they take away 3 hours of sleep. And so now they're getting 5.5 hours of sleep versus 8.5 hours of sleep. At the end of the study, they found that when individuals were well rested, they burned 55% more body fat just by getting more sleep. And so the question is, how does this happen? Melatonin, when I talked about this a little bit earlier, it's not just that it's involved in sleep, it's also involved in fat loss. And this study, this was done in the journal Pineal Research, found that melatonin production helps to increase your body's mobilization of something called brown adipose tissue, right? This is a type of fat that burns fat, all right? And the reason that it's brown is that it has more mitochondria. So it's very energy dense, right? These mitochondria, just for people who, I'm sure people have heard of this, but it's like these energy power plants in your cells that are creating the energy currency of your body, like how you experience energy, the energy exchange, something called ATP. And so when you are producing adequate melatonin, you're producing and mobilizing adequate amounts of brown adipose tissue, which just puts you in a metabolically advantaged state, all right? But if you're not getting the melatonin production, which you've got to meet 2 requirements. Number 1, you need a biological night. So that means this could actually be during the day, but it's a consistent cycle of when it gets produced. But the other requirement needs to be met, that you need darkness. Your body produces melatonin exclusively in darkness. And so that's one. Also, how do they get that body fat change? HGH production, which we talked about too. Human growth hormone is muscle sparing, and it's a big driver of energy. It's also known as a youth hormone. Kids have an insane amount of HGH being produced. This is why they have so much energy. We have a pretty sharp decline in our production right around 18 to 20. But my argument is that around 18 to 20, we generally in our culture, like we leave the house, we might go to college, that kind of thing, and we no longer have structure, we no longer have rules, and we're not going to produce as much HGH. Third thing, really quickly, is, and this all has to do with the diet and the food choices, is leptin, all right? And I know people have talked about leptin before, but leptin is your body's kind of glorified satiety hormone. And so when you're producing adequate amounts of leptin, you feel more in control, right? You feel more satiated. But when leptin kind of falls off the map, or you have leptin resistance can take place, then we're gonna have some pretty big issues with you regulating your cravings and your appetite. And so Stanford University researchers found that just one night of sleep deprivation radically suppresses your leptin. And now I hope folks can start to pay attention whenever you might not get the best sleep, how your cravings change the next day. You're gonna have a tendency to wanna, number 1, eat more, number 2, to wanna eat more kind of the starchy, crunchy, salty, sugary type things. And I remember my wife, who's actually here, when we had our son, and she's never seen me eat this food. I was sitting there like waiting for the baby to come. I was eating chocolate covered raisins. I'm just like, and I didn't even realize I was doing it. You know, it was like 3 o'clock in the morning, you know? And so that's another thing. And last one I'll share, and there's so many that create that change in your body composition, but this one is incredibly important, is cortisol. Cortisol has been drugged through the mud recently. You know, it's getting blamed for everything, but it's not really a bad guy. It's just misunderstood, all right? Cortisol is incredibly important. For example, cortisol is important for your thyroid to work, right? And that's kind of like the metabolism regulator of your body. But here's the thing, just one night of sleep deprivation radically increases your cortisol and suppresses melatonin actually as well. But this rise in cortisol has a really powerful ability to start to break down your muscle tissue, which your muscle is your body's kind of fat burning machinery. And so it can convert your muscle tissue into glucose. It's a process called gluconeogenesis as a kind of fight or flight response, because your physiology doesn't know why you're not sleeping.
The human virome will probably eventually learn that it may be more important than the bacterial microbiome. There's even a mycobiome, which are the fungi that live within us, and the molds. But the virome is really fascinating. And this is kind of, you know, we're talking about drug companies now coming out with vaccines for COVID-19, but a lot of people don't know that Eli Lilly, which is one of our major drug companies out of Indianapolis, got its start by making what are called bacteriophages. And bacteriophages are viruses that infect bacteria. And they actually got their start long before the days of antibiotics. It was learned that viruses could be used to attack and kill bacteria or manipulate bacteria. And what's fascinating about the virome is that viruses can easily infect bacteria, but they can transfer genetic information from one bacteria to another bacteria and completely change almost instantaneously how a bacteria behaves. And what we're going to learn, and I think what we are learning, is this microbiome. I call it the holobiome. It's just an incredible ecosystem where one organism is dependent on what another organism is bringing to the table. There's to decipher the language that's happening in this intense rainforest, this ecology within us. You have to have supercomputer power to figure out what one little piece of virus might be doing to one bacteria, which then spreads to billions of bacterial colonies within our gut in a matter of hours. So stay tuned.
Right. Oh my goodness, it's so fascinating. So one of the things that that we know now, that you can fit dozens, hundreds of virus particles into a single bacteria cell. Just the size and scope of it is so remarkable. But just to think about the ability for them to transfer data, that's what viruses are really, really good at. That's what they do in nature, and they're a part of us. It's kind of how we're wired up.
Yeah. It's you're right. This is data transfer, and I've tried to get people to imagine our microbiome, which includes our virome, as a cloud computer, and that our genes, we got a lousy set of genes. I mean, believe it or not, corn has more genes than you and I, which is it makes us rather humble. And we don't even have the most genes of any animal. A sand flea has more genes than you or I. And so it turns out that 99% of all the genes that are within us, you and I, are actually non-human genes. And the information processing that these genes are capable of and the exchange of information is so vast, because these bacteria replicate instantaneously. And so you take a little virus, put a couple of new pieces of information into a bacteria, which is then able to replicate and churn out billions, trillions of copies within a few hours. And then you can completely change the information that then can be sent on back to us. And I actually talk a lot about that in the upcoming book, The Energy Paradox. We now know that there is trans-kingdom communication between our microbiome and our cells. And the language of how that's communicated has been discovered. And I like to think back in World War II, one of the major changes that changed the course of the war was the breaking of the German code, the Enigma code. And when that code was finally broken, deciphered, the Allies finally figured out how Germany was talking to all the troops, to the planes. And it's the same thing. We've suspected for actually about 15 years that somehow bacteria and viruses were talking to our mitochondria, were talking to our brain, talking to our heart. but we didn't know the language. And thanks to some Nobel Prize winning work, that language was discovered. And but a lot of the energy paradox is we now know that language. So our cloud computer is actually contained inside of us. So we upload, we have so little processing power in our genetic material that we've basically uploaded most of our, lack of a better word, thinking to our cloud, which is an internal cloud of bacteria and viruses, to do the processing for us.
This is mind-blowing. I can't wait for that. Of course, we're going to have you back on to talk more about it.
That's just a teaser.
That's just a teaser trailer. Now, in this conversation about the human genome, I think this is really, really important for us to understand. And I've been talking about this for months now. But when they mapped out, like you said, our number of genes pale in comparison, even to other mammals, and not just other mammals, like you said, fruit flies.
Yeah, right? I mean, the sand flea. So, you and I are walking on the beach and we're stepping on these little, almost microscopic creatures. They got more genes than you and me.
It's nuts. Corn, et cetera, et cetera. But when the human genome was mapped out, they thought they'd find this vast array. But yet, I think it was maybe somewhere in the ballpark of 25,000.
22, yeah, 21.
And so, what, of course, other factors that they discovered was that about 8% of the human genome was viruses, endogenous retroviruses. We're actually part virus ourselves.
Yep.
What the hell? Why are we not talking about this?
Well, again, we haven't discovered what that part of our genome encodes. We used to call it dark, the dark part of our genome, that it was nonsense. And it was nonsense because we didn't know what that language was. Mm-hmm. And as we're beginning to realize that even what we think is dark genes that we don't know what they do, it's just because we haven't deciphered the language of what that encodes. And just like we had no idea that bacteria talk to us, it's like, oh, come on. These little one-cell creatures are, sending us messages. It's like, do.
It's some freaky stuff.
Yeah.
But it's so fascinating, too. And it's just where we are right now. And even in my first book, Sleep Smarter, Caltech researchers found that specific cells in the gut were communicating with, so the bacteria is communicating with cells that create our sleep-related hormones and neurotransmitters. But the language wasn't understood yet, but they knew it was happening.
Right.
Now we're going to understand more about the language. That's really, really cool. So being that we are ourselves part virus, and there's a symbiotic relationship also that we have with viruses that's overlooked. What we're attempting to do right now, which we try to do with bacteria, is kill all the stuff. Let's kill the small things. We finally discovered what creates disease in humans. Is our intention a little bit skewed? Is it a little bit off course when we're trying to kill the different viruses and to kill bacteria?
I think that's a great question. And it actually brings to the forefront, there was back in the days when bacteria were first discovered, there were two really great opposing gentlemen in France, Beauchamp and Pasteur. And so Beauchamp was actually an accomplished academician and was really one of the premier bacteriologists and virologists of his day. And Pasteur, most people don't know, Pasteur was not a physician. But Pasteur was actually a great communicator. He was what we'd use now, mediagenic. And Pasteur became famous because he figured out that wine was going bad because of bacterial contamination. Now, needless to say, if you're in France and you figure out that a bacteria might be the cause of ruining a wine crop, then you'd probably be a popular guy. And in fact, the King of France appointed him as, the head guy to oversee all science in terms of bacteriology. So what Pasteur said was bacteria are, the cause of this problem, and we need to eradicate bacteria, and that'll solve the problem. And Beauchamp said, no. You're all wrong about this. Bacteria and viruses and yeasts and molds actually coexist in a community. And the French, the word terroir is this, where you find yourself, the land. There's a terroir in winemaking of the soil, the amount of water, the viruses and bacteria and fungi on the roots, and the terroir makes the wine. So Beauchamp, throughout his career, kept saying, bacteria is just a tiny piece of this puzzle. And if the bacteria are in the right mixture with the viruses and the molds, then everything's fine. And Pasteur, because he was very mediagenic, said, no, it's the bacteria. And you're right, we have to kill the bacteria. And the word pasteurization was basically sterilize the milk or whatever. And so that whole science of killing bacteria because they were somehow evil really continued to really the present day. But what's kind of fun is they were arch rivals, and Beauchamp kind of fell from favor. But it is said, and it's in several books, that on Pasteur's deathbed, he called Beauchamp to his side, and he said, you're correct, it is the terroir. So,
Wow.
Yeah. So I think, the point of all this is, and what we've learned from how we think we know the microbiome so far, is that it is the terroir that, I'll give you an example. I see a large number of female patients who tell me that they suffer from candida, a yeast infection, and an overgrowth of yeast. And I've yet, in 20 years, never had to give any of these patients who supposedly have candida an antifungal drug. All we have to do is don't give candida what it likes to eat, which is sugar, and particular fruit sugar, and it doesn't have anything to live on, and everything else, the balance restores. So actually, I spend my career restoring terroir. That's all I do. Yeah.
This is why I'm so grateful to talk with you, because of that perspective. The body is, of course, just like everything in nature, always trying to find balance. But so often in our system, we try to attack the symptom instead of removing the cause. Let's remove the thing so things can get back into balance. It's really a simple principle. It's often a lot less expensive to do, So thank you so much for bringing that point up. And also, one of the things that I'm concerned about right now is the training that our bacteria get, that our microbiome, that our holobiome is able to receive, because it's sort of like, I liken it to like a little light workout when you interact with other people for your immune system every day. And suddenly, and I just get a red flag that goes up when anything that we do goes outside of what our genes expect us to do. And so when we're suddenly separating from other people and isolating, I wonder what that does for the health of our holobiome, for our virome, for our microbiome, that actually keeps us protected. Do you have any insight on that? Because I'm definitely very, very curious about this.
Well, I like the expression holobiome, and for folks who are saying, what the heck is a holobiome? We have species of bacteria and viruses and molds in any orifice on our skin. We have it in our mouth, we have it in our nose, we have it in our ears. Ladies, you have it in your vagina, your breast ducts. So wherever we exchange with the outside world, we have it. We even have a cloud of viruses and bacteria that are circulating around us, kind of like Pigpen in the Peanuts cartoon.
Yeah.
And this is actually a very real thing. And there's some really kind of fun research that suggests the idea of a personal space that we have, don't get too close to me, is your holobiome interacting with the holobiome of that person next to you. And there's a lot of consideration, particularly in cultures unlike America, where the idea of kissing on the cheek or hugging on both cheeks is exchanging that holobiome. In fact, there's really fun stuff that our oral microbiome decides compatibility with your mate or with whomever you're with at that particular time, because actually deep kissing is universal in all human cultures. And the theory is, and I think it's more than a theory, that our bacteria, our microbiome, our holobiome is deciding whether this mix is a good mix. And now that we know that these guys communicate with our brain, that they're sentient human beings, that maybe, so go out and kiss some people. But yeah, so, it's a fine line. And I've urged people to realize that, again, we'll talk about World War II. Can you imagine if the British sat in their bunkers for 5 years, being bombed every night, and just waited for the Manhattan Project, the atom bomb, our vaccine, and didn't arm themselves, fortify themselves, and go out and meet the enemy head on, armed. The same thing, you wouldn't send troops into battle unarmed. That would be a slaughter, but you would arm yourself. And what we've neglected, I think, with the COVID-19 is we know full well how to arm ourselves against viruses. We know very well how to do that. There are now 17 separate studies showing the higher your vitamin D level, the safer you are from COVID. And if you get COVID, it will be a mild illness. And 17 different studies now. Yeah. And one of the sad things about the Black and brown community is, I'm sorry, you guys in general don't have much vitamin D because you don't have the ability to absorb it very well. And you look at New York City, there was a study a few years ago looking at population of Queens, and only 10% of them had a vitamin D level above 30, and 10% of the population. And all of my patients, I'm running their vitamin D levels above 100. And I won't let them, out of my sight until I get their vitamin D levels above 100. And I mean, why aren't we, preaching, my gosh, folks, for $5, go get a vitamin D level and keep taking your vitamin D level and keep taking your vitamin D. It'll fortify you. The other thing that's important, we've known from day one that people with pre-existing conditions are the people who are going to get COVID. Well, start naming the pre-existing conditions. So it's obesity, it's diabetes, it's pre-diabetes, it's hypertension, it's heart disease. Well, all of those are actually from leaky gut. Hippocrates 2,500 years ago said all disease begins in the gut. And if we said, well, wait a minute, these people are set up for COVID because they have leaky gut, why don't we go and restore these guys' gut? Why don't we get gut diversity? Why don't we change the foods they're eating? And again, and this is important for your new book, in World War II, rationing was done in many countries, United States, Great Britain, Norway, Denmark. And we know the effect of rationing. And rationing was, we rationed sugar and flour. And 40% of all the food eaten in the United States in World War II was from home victory gardens. 40% of all the food. was grown at home. And you look at the incidence of diabetes, you look at the incidence of heart disease, you look at the incidence of death during World War II, and in those 5 years, all of these things dramatically plummeted. In fact, there were diabetes clinics in Norway and Denmark that closed because there were no more diabetics to take care of during the war. And so if we don't, if we just took some steps to arm ourselves, then you're right. We're surrounded by viruses 24 hours a day. We're surrounded by bacteria 24 hours a day. And they're not necessarily our enemy. They're looking for chinks in the armor. And if we don't give them the chinks, they're not going to get a toehold. And if they do get a toehold, then our immune system, if we fortify it, it was designed to handle what comes at us.
Yeah. It's even how we evolved. Our immune system itself is rooted from viruses facing off against other viruses.
What we can do right now is pretty simple. So you mentioned nutrients. First of all, we have a theory that bears out, which is eat foods that are stressed out, which is a weird concept, right? But we do it naturally. We drink, some of us drink red wine, which is a stressed grape before we pick it. We often eat colored foods. So spinach is a dark green food. There's blueberries, which are dark. The whiter ones are not as good. So why is that? Well, stressed food produces a lot of what we call xenohermetic molecules. And I'll explain what that means. It's a terrible word we coined, but xeno, X-E-N-O, means from other species. Mm-hmm. And hormesis is a very important word. You got to remember the word hormesis because every day you should think about it. Hormesis is what doesn't kill us, makes us live longer. And it's a term that means you've got to get your body out of its complacency. You've got to trigger those defenses, those longevity genes. So xenohermesis is you don't have to only run and eat well at the right times, but you can also get these molecules from the right animals and plants, but particularly plants that are stressed. Because when plants are stressed, they're making these molecules of health for their own benefit, right? They're trying to survive. They're turning on their longevity genes. We forget plants have longevity genes too. Mm. So a stressed plant will make these colored molecules to protect from UV and dehydration. When we eat them, they trigger our own body's defenses, and you can get the benefit. So that's nutrition, colored foods, stressed foods. Organic is stressed, right? You don't want the perfect lettuce that's been not put any stress. Mm. And we need to do more of that. We need to let our plants stress a little bit before we eat them. And then nutrition. There's a lot of nutrition. Now, there's a debate every week about what's good. What I do is on the part 3 of the book, I list it out. So I truly believe that we've got to mix it up, right? The secret is not so much what we eat, but when we eat. And also what we eat should have variety. So I don't say only eat meat. I don't say only eat carbohydrate. I eat a little bit of everything. I try to avoid big amounts of meat because there's one of these longevity pathways. Remember I said there are 3 main ones. One of them senses how much meat we eat and amino acids. So you need to give it time to rest and settle down. So that's important. So often I'm not eating a big steak, but I will eat meat if I've worked out because our body needs amino acids. But that's it. Make sure that actually what's more important than what you eat is when you eat. How's that for an interesting thing to say? And what we've discovered with my collaborators, and I need to give a shout out to one of my friends at the NIH, National Institutes of Health, Rafael DeCabo, he studied 10,000 mice. And what he tried to figure out was, is there a diet that makes them live longer? And he mixed combinations of carbohydrate, protein, and fat, and was hoping to see finally what works. And he found out they all did the same thing. They all had short lifespans. But there was one group where he only gave them the food 2 hours a day instead of all throughout the day. And they lived about 20 to 30% longer.
Wow.
Yeah.
Love it. Wow.
So if there's one thing I could say that I've learned after reading 10,000 papers and studying this my whole life, it's eat less often.
That's so good. That's so good. Wow. there's so much good news packed into that. And the first thing is like you get to eat, and you can see clearly with a study like that that we're debating the minutia of your macronutrient ratios, right? And for everybody can be dramatically different. But what we do see across the board is that if you take whatever deliciousness you're trying to have and compact it into a shorter window of time, and giving your body a little bit of a break, you can turn on some of these longevity genes.
That's it. So that's the key. The take-home message here is you want to trick your body into thinking times are tough, adversity, hormesis. So you can tell your body through eating stressed foods that times are going to be tough because your food supply is dying. You can trick your body into thinking that you need to be running away from saber-toothed cats because you get on a treadmill or you run or you lose your breath. Or you get hungry during the day. And that also tricks your body into thinking, whoa, I need to fight back against adversity. I need to fight against diseases. And the long-term effect of that, the benefit, is longevity.
Yeah. So just to take a small step back, because I know that and it's so cool that you talked about this a little bit in the book, but eating it's important as well, because some of us can think, and this is the American way, is like a little of something is good, massive amounts of it must be better, right? So instead of just doing an intermittent fast each day, I'll just fast for 2 weeks or whatever, you know what I'm saying? Yeah. And so, but then there's this role of something called mTOR that comes into play, and nutrition is involved in that. So can you talk a little bit about this mTOR pathway?
So mTOR is the second leg on the three-legged stool. I mentioned sirtuins.
Yeah.
mTOR is probably the most important to get right. They all talk to each other, but this is a really key one. mTOR is sensing how many amino acids are in your body, particular amino acids, leucine, isoleucine, branched-chain amino acids. And if you're always eating meat every day, your mTOR will be active. mTOR is there to grow new body parts. It's there to grow larger, taller when you're developing. The problem is if you're always feeding it amino acids and trying to bulk up, you'll get great big muscles and you'll look great. But the long-term effect of that, we've seen in animals at least, is that you're not harnessing your body's defenses, your longevity genes, the mTOR. In this case, you want to turn it off. You want to downplay it because a low mTOR activity predicts longevity. And so that's why I'm mostly focusing on plant-based foods as much as I can. But when I need to bulk up and if I work out typically every Sunday, then I will eat meat. But like you say, give your body a rest, mix it up.
Mm-hmm. So mTOR it's not talked about enough, and especially in the kind of conventional health circles and fitness circles. But this is one of the reasons we need protein. But the great news is that a small amount can go a long way, is what I'm hearing.
Well, it is. And you don't need to restrict everything. It's important to give yourself the ability to repair itself. But if you're always in this rebuild mode, always bodybuilding mode, which, you'll end up looking great, but it actually comes down to vanity versus longevity. Mm. If you only care about vanity, you're going to miss out on the longevity part. So this is the trick, is to do the exercise, do the weightlifting. You need that. I need to do a lot more, but I do it on weekends. But then give your body a break. You don't want to work out hard every day. We know that.
Yeah.
You don't want to eat 3 meals a day. We believe that's bad. And so we have to overturn what we thought, which was more is always better.
So if we can, let's talk about, because we talked about amino acids is thrown in there, but some of the specific nutrients, and one of them is resveratrol. And, we've been hearing this connected with longevity for a while. But for you to say it, it gave me a lot more mental credence as to its value. And because of that, we have the best people in the world here on my team. Somebody who read the book, and they brought in some chocolate for you that we have sitting here, some high quality dark chocolate, because of reading that is one of the sources. For me, immediately, I think back to red wine, and people was like, oh, it's resveratrol. I'm a bottle a day, right? And that's not necessarily what we're going for. There's many other sources.
Well, there is, and you can have it in its pure form too. I do that because the amount that I'm taking, and I've done so for the last 13 years, is the equivalent of 500 bottles of red wine, which I do not recommend for breakfast. Yeah, you might do your liver in. But resveratrol is super interesting because we discovered that it controlled the sirtuin longevity genes. And that was now 13 years ago. And what we've been studying ever since is how do they work and when should we eat it and what does it do? And the good news is that 13 years ago, all we were doing was extending the lifespan of baker's yeast and worms and flies. But now there have been clinical trials and there are products out there that have been tested on many people. And there are clear benefits actually in these placebo-controlled trials, which are essential. Otherwise, you don't know for sure. And you see a lowering of blood sugar, you see improvements in liver function. And these studies finally show that what we saw in mice, so initially in 2006, which by the way, that study we put out sent red wine sales up 30% and they stayed up. So anyone who has been taking red wine for the drinking red wine for the last few years, you're welcome. But seriously, the what we saw in the mice was that they were protected against high fat food. They were just as healthy against an American bad diet, wow. And they lived as long as a healthy lean one. But that's not an excuse to just sit around on the couch and pop resveratrol. By no means. What's often missed, even by scientists, is the data that's in the back of those papers. Two important points. One is if you take resveratrol every other day, you get the greatest benefit. And we've had mice living over 3 years, which is a long time for a mouse. They typically die a bit over 2. And the second thing that we learned was that if you eat it with fatty foods, it's actually better. Or you eat it with a bit of oil, it gets into the body a lot better. And so that's why I mix my resveratrol with some yogurt, just a couple of spoons in the morning. I don't want to eat a big breakfast. But without that, a lot of it's not even making it into your system. And there have been clinical trials that have failed. And when I look at how they did it, they were giving their patients or their subjects a capsule with water. And that's not going to work.
Wow, that's fascinating. That's really fascinating. I never thought about that. So it has a fat-soluble aspect to it.
Oh, for sure. It's like brick dust. Chemists would tell you brick dust. And unless it's dissolved, it just pretty much won't get absorbed by the gut.
And so we know red wine's a source. What else do we have? Besides, and also supplements.
For sure. Well, I take the supplement because you'd have to eat a lot of chocolate as well.
Yeah, right.
But, let me just make it clear that I don't know if it's going to make me live any longer. But I can tell you my cardiovascular system looks like it's a 20-year-old. So that's good. So far, so good. But what else can we do? We could peanuts, have a little bit. But unlike a lot of things we can do in our diet, resveratrol isn't found in huge quantities. There's only 1 milligram or 2 in red wine even. Yeah. And I'm taking between 500 and 1,000 milligrams.
I love the fact that you mentioned the cycling aspect. And this is true with so much. Because again, we have that some is good, more is better. Let me just do this every day. And I love the concept and also just the practicality of cycling nutrients. Because even if you just think about the way that we evolved, we're not having the same thing every day.
Yeah, and here's the great news. We used to think that calorie restriction was the way to go. And we've known for thousands of years that being hungry is good for you. But we used to think that based on monkey studies and rat studies, that those animals and we would always have to be hungry. But you've got to pulse it. You're allowed to eat and be full once in a while. And that's great news because if you give mice and rodents now, rats, food during the day, they can eat 90% of what they would normally eat in a calorie-restricted diet, but be hungry all the time. So we can live great lives. I eat a late lunch or skip lunch, but then I typically eat a really nice dinner. And I've actually grown to love food a lot more for that reason.
Wow,
because you do appreciate food rather than just shoving it down during the day. But I think I live, first of all, a much healthier life, but also one where I'm a lot more grateful for food.
Yeah, and I could personally affirm that experience. And I remember, this is over a decade ago, but I would go. This is one of the things that makes me good at what I do is that experimentation. So I would do several weeks of fasting where I'm just having juice, right? It's vegetable juice. And I remember I've shared this story before, but it might be hard to believe, but I didn't eat a salad, like an actual salad, until I was about 25 years old. That was the first time I ever had one in my life. I was raised on like fish sticks and like I was probably like 4% ravioli, like just in my blood, right? And so eating a salad just was out of my paradigm. It's just like, why would I do that? And I remember after a 21-day fast, I went and got a salad. And prior to this, just a couple weeks before I did the fast, I tried to eat the salad, went right to the trash can, gagging. Okay. I got the salad and I took the first bite, and my brain is just like lighting, just like, this is so good. I can't, but I was still scared. I'm like, I'm going to throw up any moment. And I took the next bite and I'm just like, this is the greatest thing I've ever eaten in my life. And I ate the whole little salad I'd gotten for myself. It was at Whole Foods, just like tucked in a corner. And this is true story. I was walking out, I threw the box away, and I told a random person, I was like, I just ate a salad. And they looked at me like I was from another planet. They were like, oh, okay, you know? And I was just blown away at how much I appreciated eating after not eating for so long, right? And so having those moments, even now, you know, just intermittent fasting through the day, I totally agree. Last night we had dinner. I was really crushing it yesterday, just working, doing some stuff behind the scenes. We had dinner. It was like the best meal I ever had in my life, you know? And I've had that same food before, but it's just, I appreciated it so much more.
Well, I'll confess something for the first time on your show. Now that I appreciate food and I know that food is not just pleasurable, it's actually good for you, I'll go back to my old habits, and there's food around us. That's the problem. It's everywhere. Yeah. So your reptilian brain will pick up something, shove it in your mouth, and then I'll think, that's in my mouth. Why did I do that? And I'll go through the calculation. Does this meet the criteria of whether it's worthy of eating? Do I swallow? And occasionally I'll say, no, it's not worth swallowing this crap. I don't even enjoy this. And if I'm not enjoying it, it's not worth it. So, you know, I know there's eating disorders. This is not one of those, but I only put in my mouth now what I really want to eat.
Yeah.
But I love it.
Yeah. Fascinating. You know, just opening up this conversation and looking at the different dimensions of how it's not just the food that we're eating, but how we're doing it, right? When we're eating has a huge role to play. It's just, it broadens the conversation, because I think we really can easily get caught up in the minutia, like we talked about earlier, you know, like trying to get your macronutrient ratios correct. That stuff matters, but there's a bigger conversation. And getting more into this bigger conversation in the book, you also stretch out and you get into conversation and things that we've got science behind that were really counterintuitive for me, or things that, for example, metformin, right? I want to talk about this. I spent over a decade working in my clinical practice as a nutritionist alongside physicians to help get people off metformin. And then seeing this data that you're sharing in the book, that metformin might actually be one of those, well, it is, according to your data, those things that can help to switch on those longevity genes. So let's talk a little bit about that. So just if you can, for everybody, share what is metformin and why is this something that folks are now who don't have diabetes are taking?
Yeah. So metformin is one of those gifts to humanity. It's on the list. So the World Health Organization has called it an essential medicine for humanity, because it's so safe. It's not perfectly safe, but it's so safe. And the benefits are really clear, especially for diabetics. So there are these three legs to the stool, the three pillars. Sirtuins we talked about. We talked about mTOR and amino acids. The third one is called AMPK, or AMP kinase. And this protein senses how much energy we have in the body. And if we have low amounts of energy, then it'll try to make more, and that's actually healthy. So you want to also trick your body into thinking it has low energy. You don't want low energy, but you can trick your body. So how do you do that? One is to be hungry, one is to exercise, and the other is to take a medicine that inhibits mitochondria and lowers the amount of energy that the cell's producing, so the body goes, holy crap, we're running out of energy, and it'll try to make more. And that's good for you. Now, the side effect of that is having better blood sugar levels. So your body becomes what's called insulin sensitive. You know this, that when you're type 2 diabetic, your body doesn't register the insulin that your pancreas is putting out. and it just makes more and more insulin, and eventually your pancreas can give out. But the problem with it is you have high amounts of sugar, glucose in your bloodstream, which will cross-link proteins and accelerate aging and all sorts of problems. Cardiovascular disease, wounds won't heal. And this is truly accelerating aging. We've proven that in our field. Metformin is shown to be very effective against type 2 diabetes. And if you have type 2 diabetes, your doctor will typically put you on that medicine. Now, it comes from the French lilac. It's derived from a plant. So it's a xenohermetic molecule, actually. But it's classified as a drug. So it falls into that category. So in this country, at least, but not all, you need to get a prescription for it, which actually puts it out of reach for many people. But it also makes a lot of people wary that if it comes from a doctor, it might be a little bit fishy, might be toxic. But it really has been shown in a study of over 100,000 people now, many studies actually, that diabetics who take metformin in the long run aren't just better off for diabetes, but are actually healthier and protected against cancer, heart disease, Alzheimer's, and frailty, even more so than people who don't take metformin and who don't have type 2 diabetes. That's stunning.
Yeah.
And when I heard that, I didn't believe it. My friend Neil Barzilai, Dr. Neil Barzilai is the world's expert. He told me that, and I had to go and check on these papers, which I reference in the book. It's true. So I've become a real convert. And about 2 or so years ago, I started taking metformin. I don't have diabetes yet, but I was on my way up. I actually mapped my trajectory over the last 11 years, and I could see I was headed for diabetes. It's in my family. So I stopped it in its tracks and actually reversed type 2 diabetes. Now I'm at no risk of having diabetes because I'm on metformin, because I've made these changes in my life. Now, is it for everybody? I think if you're young and your blood glucose levels are low, not needed if you're exercising and eating right. But I'm 50 now, and if your blood glucose goes up every year and you can't control that, metformin, I think, is a good thing to talk about with your doctor.
Yeah. You know what? And just since you just mentioned that being 50, if folks aren't watching the video on YouTube, you look like maybe 30s, like 35, You have this, and your energy is high. You're creating all these different projects, working on different papers. So you have that aspect. Your physical appearance, like you're living proof of the stuff you talk about. And I can see you're just getting warmed up as well, And so just a little shout out for those who are listening to audio. The guy's got it dialed in, And so, but I wanted to bring this up because I also, with the Model Health Show, I want to stretch our thinking. We do, like I mentioned, I was looking at what can I do for these patients to help them to normalize their blood sugar naturally, right? And removing the cause oftentimes was, Mountain Dew or whatever it was, but if we eliminate those things and your body is already in a healthy state, adding in these different medications, potentially, again, this is just a conversation I want to get going, there might be some potential benefits. And this is still early, but it really got me thinking when I was reading the book. And one of the other aspects, I think this might go back to, because for me, I think that metformin can compete with some of the hormetic benefits of other things potentially, right? So can you talk a little bit about that? Maybe let's talk about exercise in that context, because it's a hormetic stressor.
Yeah.
So how does that compete?
Yeah, so remember we're working with a very complex machine, our bodies, and there are these 3 legs of the stool, but we don't know exactly which ones to tweak and when. We're still figuring this out as scientists. The good news is that we live in a world now where scientists can talk directly to the public, and we put out newsletters, so you don't have to wait 10 years to hear it from your doctor, or 20 years. But the honest truth is we don't know exactly what the best combination is, and we're learning actually that sometimes you don't want to combine them at the same time. You might want to do them on off days, and metformin and exercise is a case in point. Now, what we've just discovered in a couple of papers that came out this year only is that metformin, because it tricks the body into having low energy by inhibiting the mitochondrial energy levels, if you give elderly patients metformin and give them ask them to do weightlifting, they will bulk up, both of them, all right, both sets, with metformin, without, but the ones that didn't get metformin will have bigger muscles, okay? But not a lot bigger. They all got bigger muscles. So it is inhibiting the growth, the hypertrophy of muscle. But here's what's not talked about on social media or appreciated by a lot of people. Those people, those elderly people, were all the same strength, even though they didn't have the same sized muscles. So it still gave them the benefits. They just didn't look as bulky. So that's where I go back to vanity versus longevity.
Right.
But I think there is a way to optimize it. We don't know for sure. And Dr. Peter Attia, our friend, he argues this with me. And he also agrees, at least on this point, that we don't want to be taking metformin on days where our muscles are growing. That's probably the best. And that's what I try to do. I skip metformin when I go to the gym. But we disagree on exactly what the precise combination is. But he also thinks that fasting for a long time is good. And I don't know if that's true. I find it extremely difficult to go for more than one day. I start to lose, my blood sugar goes too low, and I've measured it with one of those monitors that you can stick them on.
Right.
Fascinating, by the way. Have you done that?
Yeah, the 24 hour, I mean, it just stays with you.
2
I haven't,
weeks,
no.
yeah.
Yeah, many of my friends have.
You learn a lot. And actually, I didn't have breakfast. I can feel it right now. My blood sugar levels are going low. I should eat some chocolate, actually. But yeah, if I go for 3 days or a week like Peter does, he actually is turning on pathways that I think are even more beneficial.
Yeah.
There's one called chaperone-mediated autophagy, which is basically super recycling of the body's proteins. And that's something I think that he's right about. And if you can go for 3 days, more power to you.
Right. Yeah. And I love that so much because when I made the reference earlier about some is good, more massive amounts is great. There's usually something there in the middle or closer towards, that little bit, those little micro doses, and having an extended fast, of a few days. Obviously, you're going to activate more of these different beneficial processes, autophagy, and the list can go on and on. But we also have to be mindful of the longevity aspect of happiness. I think that we don't talk enough about this. First of all, and this is just something consistent that I see, I'll read, I don't know why I do this all the time, but whenever something comes across my attention or my phone or a friend or somebody that lives to be 100 years old or older, I interview them, I read their stories, I read their articles, and there's this consistent thread of happiness. There's this consistent thread of meaning in their lives, So if you're going to be pissed for 3 days and just a Krabby Patty, right? Just mad at everybody, really, it doesn't equal out for me the potential benefit that you could be getting.
Yeah, that's right. So when we calorie restrict these mice in my lab, they also get really crabby. They fight with each other, especially the boys. So it's natural, but you need to overcome it. Yeah. But I totally agree that if you're not happy, it's not worth it. But the key to happiness is mission. Yeah. And I just came from a conference where we were talking about how to optimize those 3 legs on the stool. And one of the speakers was Dr. Cooper. He's the guy that coined the term aerobics. And you might say, wow, he must be 100 years old. He's almost. I mean, he's in his late 80s. But he's had a mission in life to make people live longer. And he's treated presidents, the first Bush, George Bush. And his mind is super quick. He's talking like this, bam, bam, bam. You think, you're not 80, you're more like a 20-year-old in the way you talk and think and move. Now, these are test cases. These aren't clinical trials. But when you see him, he's been doing aerobics for the last 40, 50 years. I mean, a guy like that, you want to mimic that. And what he's shown in thousands of patients that he's treated and tens of thousands of kilometers or miles that his patients have run, he can reduce the rate of aging, clearly. And through the trajectory of his patients, instead of the average lifespan being 80, which is what it is at best for this country, he gets them out to near 90. So it's clearly the case that if you do what he's recommending, you eat the right way, starting at an earlier age, you don't have to live to 80. You can play tennis at 90, maybe live to 100.
Yeah.
But wait till there's new technologies coming.
Yeah, so exciting.
Hippocrates used to teach that there's, within all of us is translated from Greek, a green life force energy that every organism has that wants, for lack of a better word, perfect health. If you have green life force energy, then you will withstand whatever comes at you. You will protect yourself. And he was convinced that there were external forces that were preventing green life force energy from showing itself, and that a physician's job was to identify those external forces that were preventing the expression of green life force energy and remove those external forces, or teach the patient to remove them. And then the patient would heal himself. And what's fascinating is Hippocrates was absolutely right. So what I've done in the last 20 years is I just do detective work and say, okay, what are these external forces, many of which are food, and many of which are the products we've made to keep ourselves comfortable, and remove as much as we can. We can even talk about natural light, change these things. Yeah. And so let me give you a great example. Recently, I have a lot of snowbirds in my practice that, go away for the summer and then come back in the winter. And I have an 85-year-old woman who I recently saw, who is a snowbird, and she came back this fall to Palm Springs, and she's married to an 86-year-old gentleman. She's in my practice. He thinks that what she and I do is just the silliest thing and wants nothing to do with it. And one of the things we did, among other things, I always run everybody's vitamin D very high. I've never seen vitamin D toxicity. And we do a lot of other things with food, as you know. And he just poo-pooed it. And he's 85, what the heck. So they both caught COVID-19 at the end of March. And so, I saw her a few weeks ago, and I said, well, wow, what was that like? And she said, well, for me, it wasn't much of anything. She said, I felt like, I had a bad cold for 48 hours, and that was it. She said, my husband wound up in intensive care for 56 days, nearly didn't make it. He just got released from the hospital 3 weeks ago. So he was in the hospital for literally 6 months. So she leans over to me. She says, guess what he's taken now? A lot of vitamin D. And he says, I should have listened to you. And just yesterday, before coming here, I have a Hispanic woman in her 50s. The entire family caught COVID, except her. She's my only patient. And her husband actually died from COVID, a 55-year-old gentleman, a Hispanic gentleman. And so, this is decimating a lot of our communities. And I think it's because a lot of our communities, number one, aren't aware that food is one of the greatest ways that we can protect ourselves or learn to cooperate with the viruses and bacteria and molds that are always going to be present with us. And it's this balance that can be achieved.
What's so fascinating for me, and one of the things I keep trying to impress upon culture right now, is that right now, somewhere around 70 million confirmed cases, and of people who are okay, who survived. And the question is, how do they do it? Vast majority of them didn't even have any symptoms. We'll say somewhere close to half. How do they do that without some kind of medical intervention? Their immune system did what it was designed to do. And our immune system is literally made from food. It's made from our natural killer cells to our T cells. The list goes on and on. Our lymphatic system, everything about us is made from the food that we eat. This should definitely be a top priority, but I'm just going to ask you, why is it not a part of this conversation? Why is the task force not up there saying, okay, guys, make sure that you wash your hands, but also we really need to hone in on getting our food together as a society?
It's bad for business. I had recently on my podcast David Kessler, who was the former head of the FDA. He's been dean of Yale Medical School, dean of UCSF Medical School. He's now on President-elect Biden's COVID task force. And when he was head of the FDA, the food nutrition label was made on the back of packages. And as he tells the story, when oh, there's this much fat and this much sugar and this much protein, and when they were working on the sugar label, he wanted to make sure that everyone knew that carbohydrates were sugar, and that all carbohydrates should be labeled as sugar. And so this was sent to the Department of Agriculture, and the Department of Agriculture called the president and said, "You can't let this maniac do this." And the president calls David Kessler and said, "Get over here." And big agriculture's there, big food's there, and they go, "What are you doing? You can't tell people how much sugar is in these products." And he said, "Well, what do you mean? That's what's in it." And they said, "No one would buy this. And this is what we sell. This is what the Department of Agriculture does. Fix it." And so he tells this great story, and I'll tell it to anyone who will listen. He said, "Let's take a bagel." And he says, so you look at that, there's 0 fat in the bagel, there's a couple grams of protein in the bagel, and it says 33 grams of carbohydrates, 0 grams of sugar. And you go, "Oh, that's a health food." And he says, no. He said, it turns out that those finely processed starch molecules in wheat are so highly processed that it is more sugar than table sugar. And so if you do the calculations correctly, there are 8 teaspoons of sugar in that healthy bagel that will raise your blood sugar faster than if you swallowed 8 teaspoons of table sugar. And he said, and you won't see it on the label because we're not allowed to tell you.
Wow. That's really messed up.
It's really messed up. And, I give a lecture to the diabetics. And during the Obama administration, when Michelle Obama was planting victory gardens at the White House and was educating kids, particularly in the Black community, about the importance of fresh fruit and fresh vegetables, at the same time, the Department of Agriculture signed a deal with Domino's Pizza that they would pay $100 million in free advertising for Domino's Pizza if Domino's Pizza would add twice the amount of cheese to their pizzas than they were previously. And they actually made a big fanfare of the fact that the Department of Agriculture was supporting, our farmers, our dairy farmers. At the same time, Michelle Obama was supporting, healthy eating. And so that's the tug, that's the tear. And, and this is people listening to you, people have to be aware that nobody from up is going to tell us the right way to eat. This has to be a grassroots movement, and it has to start with all of us.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. One of the things that I definitely, I'm very big on the Jerry Maguire, show me the money, and kind of tracing that thing back. I just don't want to operate on a theory. And so, of course, the theory would be that the major crops that our government provides subsidies for, hundreds of billions of dollars, are making us sick. That's the theory. But I went and traced it, and I came across an incredible study, and they tracked the pathway of these massive factory farm crops, the wheat and the corn and all these things that largely show up through the drive-through window and in processed foods. And they tracked the consumption, and the folks who had the greatest consumption of these government subsidized crops were 40% more likely to be obese. We know this.
Yeah.
And these are the very foods that our government is funding for us to eat. And then it circles back around to us getting caught in the system of medicine. And now we're paying for pills. But the funny thing is, even when I say our government, we're paying for it.
Sure.
That's the most messed up part, And I think that if we really get this, we can demand better. But I just think we just don't know that this is happening. And so I'm so grateful for the work that you're doing. And I would like to talk about something else that just keeps popping up in my mind as you're talking, which is yesterday, I looked out the window and I saw the mailman pull up to my neighbor's mailbox. He already had gloves on. He sanitized his hands with the gloves. Then he reached for the mail, put in the mailbox. He pulled up to our mailbox, sanitized his hands and his gloves, reached for the mail, put in our mailbox. And I'm sure he kept doing that all the way down the street. And my question is, we know that many of these products are, they're designed to kill small things, right? It's what they're meant to do, antibacterial, antiviral, whatever the case may be. And now we're at a place where even when I went to the DMV, once you get up from your chair, literally somebody comes over and starts spraying down the chair, wiping everything down. Could these products be creating a problem for our health as well? That we're not just using, now I believe we're overusing to the degree that, when kids are in school, if they get to go to school, they have so many of these crazy, synthetic, dangerous products that obviously they're going to be inhaling, obviously they're going to be interacting, putting on their skin. Should we be a little bit more aware that this is happening?
Yeah, the idea that these disinfectants are going to protect us is, particularly with COVID-19, is a bit naive. COVID-19 is really an airborne virus, and it really does not survive well on surfaces for very long. And what's fascinating about COVID-19, and there's some really cool studies out of China that are just now being published about transmission in restaurants. And it actually has to do with airflow, where the fans or ventilation or open windows are in restaurants. And they've tracked through really good contact tracing, who was getting it. And so, for instance, if we're in this room, if someone across the room is facing me, and I happen to have asymptomatic COVID, and the window behind me is open, then that person facing me has a pretty doggone good chance of catching it. Whereas if that person is opposite and facing the other way, he's not going to get it. And same thing with the tangential people, they're not going to get it. So it's the air movement that's actually critical. So all the little hand washing things out in the mailbox, that's not going to protect us. But you're right. I mean, we learned with Ticacin, which we used to be in all of our toothpaste, it used to be in all of our antibacterial cleansers, that this thing is a major estrogen disruptor.
Yeah.
And, talk about promoting obesity by sanitizing, our skin and sanitizing our teeth and our mouthwash. Little did we know that we were, swallowing an estrogen-like substance. And it's like, oh, I don't want to do that. And who knows what, the rest of these products are going to have. We just don't know. That's not what we need to do. We need to fortify our cells. We need to become, one with the earth, to be, silly. If we have a great terroir, there's really not much that's going to happen to us. Yeah, we might catch COVID, but like you say, the vast majority of people who catch it are just going to have a mild interaction with this virus. We have mild interactions with viruses probably every day that we're not aware of, and our immune system takes care of it. May I bring up one other point about that?
Please do.
Okay. So we hear about cytokine storms. So our immune system, I like to use the example of 95% of us are born with a preformed antibody to peanut, the peanut lectin. Lectins are one of my favorite subjects. So 95% of us are born with an antibody that if we see a peanut lectin, we should hate it. When I was growing up, there were no such things as peanut allergies. Kids ate peanuts in schools. Nobody carried EpiPens to school. Now, of course, we have an epidemic of peanut allergies, and kids literally are carrying EpiPens to school. We've always had antibodies to peanuts. So why is it now that those antibodies are going crazy and they never did before? And that's because our microbiome, number one, educates our immune system. It tells the immune system, hey, we got you covered. We're the first line of defense. We're going to see these guys, whatever they are, long before you. We're going to eat them or we're going to detoxify them. And if they get past us, just chill out. It's okay. They're not as bad actors as you think. And immune system actually learns from our microbiome. And there's actually really cool microscopic pictures of filamentous bacteria going through the walls of our intestinal cells and making like kind of ET contact with, they're in our human cells, teaching human cells. It's like, woo. So the immune system learns. Now, contrast that now that we have a decimated microbiome because we've killed them all with all the antibiotics in our food and that we take. Not only that, we now have, most of us have leaky gut because of the things we eat. And now our immune system is on high alert. It's like our borders are constantly under attack. We're on threat level 5. And so if we see a potentially not very interesting foreign antigen, like say a COVID-19, before our immune system would go, yeah, that's a pretty interesting guy. Yeah, let's go eat it and, we'll be okay. Now our immune system drops a nuclear bomb and we have this cytokine storm calling our immune system, onto high alert. And it's no wonder that these cytokine storms are happening to our people with pre-existing diseases. And so it's no wonder if you don't have these pre-existing diseases and you've got yourself in good immunologic shape and you got a healthy microbiome, then it's just, it's another interesting virus.
This is beyond fascinating and such a needed conversation. And I know folks are wondering what they can do. Obviously, there's been a lot of framing of fear, worry, uncertainty, an incapability to even take care of oneself, just hide out and wait for a solution to come along. And of course, we've talked about, of course, you want to be intelligent, exercise, caution, but most importantly, we have to be a little bit more empowered in getting ourselves healthier and more resilient. So if you could, you've already mentioned one, which is the vitamin D piece, which is so important, especially as you mentioned, for folks with more melanin. It's like built-in sunscreen, and so we evolved in a space where, we got a lot more sun exposure. And so your body kind of builds up a resistance. So you need a little bit more. So if we can, of course, get some sun exposure, but really important right now, I think, would be to supplement with vitamin D. So if you can talk about where we should target there and maybe one other thing, maybe two, if you can, if you feel called to, things that we can do right now proactively to make ourselves more resilient.
Let me give you something else that we learned from World War II. Now, I've already talked about when rationing was instituted, how much healthier everyone got. Certainly that's number one. But one of the striking, sad findings, and that was actually really important, was the concentration camp survivors. Obviously, large number of people died in concentration camps, but the survivors who were literally starved to death for the most part. One of the shocking things among the survivors was that these people never were ill, never got the flu, never got a cold, never got cancer. And you would have thought that in their profound weakened condition, that they'd be a setup for, catching a death of a cold, getting pneumonia, but they didn't. And that was actually, researchers said, that doesn't make any sense. Their immune system ought to be shot. They should be a setup. What's the deal? Well, it turns out that fasting is actually one of the best ways to make your immune system strong, because we're designed, and I talk a lot about this in my books, we're designed in crisis, if you will, that our green life force energy will empower every system to protect you, because if you don't make it through this hard time, you're not going to be around to reproduce. And at the end of the game, that's what we got to keep around to do. So it was actually these concentration camp survivors that were the impetus, sadly, to find out why simple fasting actually gets your immune system revved up to protect you. So what I ask people to do is, folks, just start skipping breakfast. If you wanted to do one thing to change your ability to fight infection, skip breakfast. And everybody goes, but breakfast is the most important meal of the day. Well, I can assure you that our ancestors didn't crawl out of the cave and say, what's for breakfast? There wasn't any breakfast. There wasn't a refrigerator. There wasn't a pantry shelf. There was nothing. We had to find, break, fast. And you look at hunter-gatherers like the Hansas, they don't eat breakfast. They head out and they may eat breakfast at lunch, but we're designed not to eat breakfast. Breakfast is a cultural phenomenon, and quite honestly, Big Food taught us that breakfast is the most important meal of the day. Remember, no one ever ate a bowl of cereal until 1906. Never existed. The Brits never had a bowl of cereal until 1941, when America arrived and brought it. It didn't exist as a food.
It's power of marketing.
Power of marketing. If you say an untruth long enough and loud enough, it will become true.
Hey, if you like this video, make sure to check out this video right here to up-level your health today. Fat in foods does not directly translate to the fat on our bodies, right? Storage fat or structural fats, but there are specific fats that do contribute to the performance and rebuilding your structural fats in your brain.